Hi folks, this is David Birchall. I'm doing this week's lecture pods for When Worlds Collide. Unfortunately, as you can see, you can't actually see me this week. I hope I'll have the video sorted next week. Instead, you have a PowerPoint with audio, which hopefully will do the job. This is the content of the two lecture pods for this week. I've divided into two. I'm about to give you the first one, and if you search on views, you'll find the other one immediately following it. On the right-hand side of the screen there, by the way, is a bloke called William Fielding, an early British English visitor to India in the 17th century, looking resplendent in his Indian-like garb. I'll come back to that in a little while. So some introductory explanation of India when the British, or rather the English as they then were, arrived there in the 17th century. Prior to British rule, as it says in the dot points there, India was the centre of one of the world's great empires, the Mughal, or sometimes Mughal, same difference, empire, which covered the entirety of the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent as we call it today, modern day India, Pakistan, Afghanistan and Bangladesh, or a good part of Afghanistan at least. It was at this time in the 17th century one of the great economic powers of the world. It bestrides important trade routes in Asia and into Southeast Asia, between Southeast Asia and East Asia, and economic historians estimate that in the middle of the 18th century the territories perhaps generated a quarter of the gross domestic product of the world at that time. Obviously that's guesswork. So no OECD or similar international bodies in the 17th century. The Mughals were invaders into the Indian subcontinent, and they ruled to some extent apart from the mass of the local population. They had brought an additional population with them in their travels. They lived in great splendour. They relied upon their splendour to some extent to cement their rule. It was a glorious, spectacular form of display that they engaged in. A lavish court, gorgeous buildings. The most famous example, of course, that every Australian who travels to India always sees, the Taj Mahal, the great monument of one of the emperors, the Mughal emperors, to his beloved deceased wife. Just to give a sense of perspective here, just so that we don't get confused and lost. In 1700, around about the time when our story starts, the population of India, speaking broadly, meaning the territories on the right-hand side of the screen there, the Mughal Empire at that time, was about 125 million people, which is not much more than 10% of the population of India today, but then the population of the world has grown dramatically over that time. At the same time, in 1700, the population of England was about 5 million, and I think from memory the entire British Isles was less than 10. And so the British come to India not to conquer, but to adventure, to discover, to make money. Absolutely clearly aware that they could not enjoy any sort of superiority over the Mughals, other than possibly than some native brute cunning. Who were the Mughals? Well, one of the great travelling dynasties of history. They owe their ancestry, so legend at least has it, to Genghis Khan and his travelling hordes of the Middle Ages. They went into northern India, as I said, there in the early 16th century, that's the 1500s, and then spread their rule quite quickly through the territory of India to create an empire that dominated the continent well after the time that the British first arrived there. It was a multinational, multicultural, multi-ethnic empire, a bit like the Roman Empire, or earlier the Athenian Empire in the ancient world, the Macedonian Empire, or the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean basin, with which it bore a lot of cultural similarity. So the Mughals were warriors, but they settle in the Indian subcontinent, and they develop public administration, imperial administration that straddles the continent. But they do so in the manner of multicultural empires. There's the Roman Empire done, the Ottoman Empire around about the same time in the Mediterranean. They allowed different peoples and cultures and religious groupings to live side by side, but basically in distinct communities, often with little connection to one another. This was convenient because it helped keep people calm and peaceful. It was convenient as well because it enabled them to practice a tactic or a strategy, actually, really, of dividing and conquering the different, if you like, subject peoples of the Mughal Empire. The Mughals were Muslim, and they were drawing upon the Muslim tradition that, of course, had grown up in the Middle East in the 8th century and afterwards. But they broadly tolerated the other religions of the subcontinent, of course, most notably the Hindu and Sikh religions, some Buddhism as well, and other native religions. Also worth remembering, we say those religions now as though they're religions, but there was no one thing called Hinduism and no one thing called Buddhism in the 17th century. That's a kind of modern creation. The chief language of the Mughal Empire was Persian, which obviously had come from modern-day Iraq and the Near East. But Arabic was the literary religious language, as it was also in Persia at the time and elsewhere. Scholars spoke Arabic, religious scholars spoke Arabic, but very, very few amongst the wider population did. Persian was a language used in the territories where the Mughals themselves are settled. In other parts of India, there were a range of different languages, a bewildering range of languages. And so the Mughal India was multi-religious, multinational, and multilinguistic as well. Last dot point there, as I've mentioned already, the Mughal empires practiced divide and rule or divide and conquer tactics so common amongst imperial autocrats over the millennia, and that required them to keep the rival Indian princes and their principalities at bay, setting them against one another when it was convenient and making peace when it was convenient too. So the Mughals unified the territory of India administratively and ruled it centrally, but politically they fragmented it into a range of different states and principalities, and that's the way it remained when the British arrived. The first Englishman of note to arrive in India is the subject of Bamber Gascoigne's reading up on Views for this week. A man called Thomas Roe, there he is with a splendid moustache on the right hand side of the screen, for the first English ambassador to the court of the Mughals in the early 17th century. He was sent by the English monarch James I, who you can see in the bottom right hand corner there wearing the very fancy outfit in sort of silver thread, I think it is. James had sent him to form a trade agreement on behalf of the newly formed East India Company. I'll say more about the East India Company in the second pod. I won't talk about it here. His trade, his business was diplomacy. He realised that the English could bring no military threat against the Mughal rule. All that they could attempt to do was negotiate, and negotiate using money as a lure. Roe was a skilled and experienced diplomat. He'd served in various missions previously, Sweden, Turkey, Algiers, at least two of which, as you can guess, were also Muslim territories, so he had some sense of how to handle people of religions other than his own. And he also realised that diplomacy, as it always does, required a capacity to engage with other people's cultures and other people's languages without causing offence, or they might throw you out of the country, or even worse. Roe was a man of letters who kept diaries and notes. He had a curiosity for other cultures, also a very useful thing if you're a diplomat. And his diary of his time in Emperor Jahangir's court in Agra is a major source for us of information about Mughal rule, given that the Mughals themselves did not make those kinds of records usually. And also that it reveals for us Roe's ability to win for himself a role in the emperor's court and to start to establish the first time an English presence, however tiny, in the English subcontinent. With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to see that Roe's mission, tiny as it was, a trade mission really, was the first step in what became a later expansion of English influence in India. As Roe realised the emperor's or the Shah's rule in Agra, the centre of the Mughal Empire, was not entirely unfamiliar. It closely resembled the rule of European absolute monarchs at the same time, almost the same time, a few decades later in Europe. Louis XIV in France ruled in a similar way. He had a court outside of Paris in a place called Versailles. That was both a royal court and a centre of public administration, with all sorts of elaborate protocols and rules of precedence. that both governed the country and governed the court and established Louis' supremacy. Very similar to the court in Agra. Extraordinary, complex, minute ceremonies and hierarchy of the court, which was delineated by their physical presence or distance from the emperor. Rowe could make sense of all of this because it wasn't actually totally foreign. Highly hierarchical pre-modern societies often share similar features, and he was already familiar with trying to find the similarities. So you can see on the image on the right hand side of the screen there, and this is all again described by Bamber Gascoigne, the emperor sits on a throne in the palace on a raised balcony, and everyone else prostrates themselves before him at various heights and depths according to their rank. So Rowe's task, starting at the very bottom of this hierarchy, was to work himself up the hierarchy by means of skill and influence and flattery and persuasion to become one of the emperor's confidants, which he did. And this required, of course, a fine balance between deference to the emperor's magnificence and some kind of dignity as a representative of the English crown, however far away it was. And that balancing act is well described in his account. Rowe arrived at Agra, as said already, without power or great influence. He brings a letter from the king and he's on a mission, but he has no troops and he has no clout. Certainly he can bring no threats to bear. And he is trying to inveigle himself into a country where the other Europeans, notably the Dutch and the Portuguese, had already been, without enormous success. So he's compelled to act indirectly, as I've said already, by skill and good manners. He was forced to act like a European courtier. And as it happens, we have a whole literature of courtliness from 16th century and 17th century Europe, such as the Book of the Courtier by the Italian Castiglione, which helps give us a sense of what Rowe was up to here. A great deal of interpersonal skill, charm, and diplomacy all mixed together. He acquires and makes use of the major languages and attempts to understand Mughal culture. In return, Jahandir is interested in aspects of English and European culture and curious about them and wants to know more and get the proverbial trinkets that one gets from other people when they're travelling. So this becomes one of the great cross-cultural dialogues between Europe and this great power in the Indian Ocean, and also the very first tiptoe by the English into this vast continent that they later intended to rule.